If you are new here, understand this clearly. You are not entering a motivational space. You are entering a mirror that does not soften what it reflects. And if you've been here before, you already know the pattern is changing inside you in ways you cannot easily explain yet. Either way, adjust your attention. This is not background content. Turn on subtitles if you want every idea to land precisely. Not for comfort, but for clarity. Now listen carefully. Every time you give in, you are not relieving pressure. You are training something quieter, something more dangerous than the habit itself. You are training a weaker version of yourself to become familiar. And familiarity is how identity is built. Most people misunderstand addiction at the surface level. They think it is about pleasure, or impulse, or lack of discipline. That is what it looks like from the outside. But inside, where behavior actually forms, something more consistent is happening. Repetition is teaching your nervous system who you are allowed to be when no one is watching. And each time you say, just this once, you are not breaking a rule. You are reinforcing a version of you that already knows how to lose without resistance. There is a moment you never notice. It comes right before you give in. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is subtle, almost rational. A quiet negotiation in your head that sounds reasonable enough to trust. You've had a long day. You deserve a break. You'll stop after this. It doesn't matter this time. That moment is not weakness. It is identity in transition. Because in that small pause, two versions of you are present. One is built from intention, long-term clarity, self-respect that does not depend on emotion. The other is built from repetition, familiar escape routes, short-term relief patterns. The version of you that has already practiced surrender enough times to make it feel normal. And what wins that moment decides something deeper than behavior. It decides which version of you gets reinforced. Most people think they are fighting addiction. They are not. They are reinforcing whichever identity they choose, most often under pressure. And pressure always reveals what repetition has built. Think about how it actually plays out. You are alone. Not physically alone necessarily, but internally unobserved. No consequences in the immediate environment. No accountability in that exact moment. Just thought and impulse interacting without friction. And in that space, your mind offers you a shortcut. Not because it is evil. Not because you are broken. But because it has learned a pattern that reduces discomfort quickly. And here is the part most people never examine. The brain does not distinguish between escape and solution in the moment of relief. It only registers outcome. Relief happened. Tension decreased. Cycle completed. So it stores the sequence as valid. Do it again. This is how a weaker version of you becomes automated. Not through intention. Through confirmation. Every repetition says, this is who we are when discomfort rises. And slowly, without announcement, your identity shifts from someone who resists to someone who reacts. There is a difference between those two that most people never fully understand. A reactive person lives inside immediate emotional conditions. Their decisions are shaped by current sensation. A resistant person lives one layer above sensation. They observe the urge without becoming it. But resistance is not natural at first. It is constructed, and construction requires interruption. The interruption is what most people avoid. Because interruption feels like discomfort without resolution. It forces you to sit in the gap between impulse and action. That gap is where identity change either happens or collapses. And most people collapse it instantly. Not because they cannot endure it, but because they have trained themselves not to. That is the hidden part. You are not dealing with a single moment of weakness. You are dealing with accumulated training. And every relapse is not random. It is predictable based on what you have practiced most. Now there is something uncomfortable you need to see clearly. When you give in, you are not just losing control in that moment. You are rehearsing your future responses. Because the brain does not store behavior as isolated events. It stores it as pathways. And pathways become faster each time they are used. So the question is no longer, why do I keep doing this? The real question is, why does this pathway feel more familiar than discipline? And the answer is not emotional. It is structural. Familiarity beats intention when intention has not been reinforced. This is where most advice fails. People are told to be stronger, try harder, stay motivated. But motivation is not a structure. It is a fluctuation. What actually changes behavior is repetition under resistance. Not dramatic change. Small controlled refusals. The kind no one sees. The kind that feel insignificant in the moment but compound silently. Because every time you do not give in, something just as real happens as when you do. You train the stronger version of you to become slightly more accessible. And the weaker version loses authority it once had. Not immediately, gradually, until one day, the urge still appears, but it no longer feels like a command. It feels like noise. But before you reach that stage, there is a phase most people get stuck in. The identity conflict phase. This is where you start seeing the pattern, but still participate in it. You become aware, but not yet aligned. And this is the most unstable version of change. Because awareness without discipline creates frustration. You start judging yourself while repeating the same loop. And that internal contradiction becomes its own form of pressure. So you escape again, not just from the urge, but from the discomfort of self-awareness without control. This is why discipline cannot be emotional. It has to be structural. A system that does not require agreement from your mood. Now pause here internally for a moment. Notice how often your decisions are not made by you, but by the condition you are in. Tired version of you, bored version of you, stressed version of you, lonely version of you. Each one has different standards. And if you are not careful, you become a collection of temporary identities rather than a stable one. This is the core instability addiction exploits. It does not need to destroy you. It only needs you to stay inconsistent long enough that inconsistency becomes normal. At that point, discipline feels foreign. And escape feels like home. There is a reason this feels hard to break. Because you are not removing a habit. You are replacing a default identity. And identity does not change through insight alone. It changes through refusal. Repeated refusal in moments where no one would know if you failed. That is where the real shift begins. Not in understanding, in interruption, in the decision to not follow the familiar script one more time. Even when nothing external forces you to. Even when no reward is immediate. Even when your mind argues convincingly. And it will argue. It will present logic that feels precise. But it is not logic. It is pattern preservation. Because the system inside you that wants relief does not care about your long-term vision. It cares about closure. And it will always choose the fastest route to closure unless you override it through repetition of resistance. At some point in your life, you were trained into your current patterns. And anything that was trained can be retrained. But only through consistency that does not depend on emotion. There is a moment later in this process where something shifts quietly. The urge still appears, but it no longer carries authority. It becomes recognized as an old signal with no current power. But you are not there yet. Right now, you are still in the phase where the decision feels like a negotiation. And that negotiation is costing you identity stability every single time. So the real question forming underneath everything you just heard is simple. When the pressure rises again, which version of you will be rehearsed? The one that escapes, or the one that interrupts? And that answer is not theoretical. It is being decided repeatedly, in silence, long before anyone sees the outcome. Midway through this realization, something uncomfortable usually happens. You start noticing how automatic your reactions really are. Not just in addiction, in everything. And that is where this becomes harder to ignore. Because once you see the pattern in one area, you start recognizing it everywhere else. But that recognition is not the end. It is the beginning of pressure. And pressure will demand a response. The only question is which identity you have been practicing under it. And that has not fully revealed itself yet. Not completely. What most people never realize is that the moment of decision you experienced earlier is never actually about the present. It is about what your nervous system expects will happen next. Because your mind is not reacting to reality directly. It is reacting to predictions built from repetition. And if your history is filled with the same response to discomfort, then discomfort itself becomes a signal that automatically triggers a familiar ending. Not because you choose it. Because your system expects it. This is where the illusion of free choice begins to weaken. You think you are deciding in real time. But in reality, you are confirming an already rehearsed outcome. That is why it feels like you slip. But nothing slips without a slope already formed. And that slope is built from every previous moment you didn't interrupt. each one lowering resistance just enough for the next repetition to feel easier. Until eventually, the decision is no longer experienced as a decision at all. It becomes a reflex. And when behavior becomes reflexive, identity stops being questioned. It just runs. There is a reason addiction feels cyclical instead of linear. It is not randomness. It is conditioning looping through the same neural pathways, strengthening them each time they are activated, while unused pathways slowly lose efficiency. This is not metaphorical. It is structural adaptation. The brain optimizes for efficiency, not meaning. So whatever you repeat becomes cheaper to access. And whatever you resist becomes harder to initiate. This is why discipline feels heavy at first. Not because it is unnatural, but because it is underdeveloped. Meanwhile, the weaker pattern feels effortless. Because it has been rehearsed into automation. So when you find yourself returning to the same behavior, what you are really experiencing is not moral failure. It is energetic preference shaped by repetition. And that is harder to confront. Because it removes drama from the situation. There is no villain in the story. Only conditioning. And that makes responsibility more precise. Not emotional. Precise. Now there is a phase in this cycle that most people misunderstand deeply. It is the phase where awareness increases, but behavior does not change. You begin to see the pattern clearly. You can predict it. You can even explain it to yourself in real time. And still, you repeat it. This is where frustration is born. Because you assume understanding should equal control. But understanding is only informational. Control is behavioral, and the gap between those two is where most people remain stuck. They become intelligent about their own patterns, but unchanged by them. This creates a subtle internal split. One part of you observes. The other part continues acting. And the observer slowly becomes more critical. Until the behavior side starts feeling like something separate from you. Something you are trying to fix, but not fully governing. This is where self-fragmentation begins. Not dramatically, quietly. You start saying things like, I don't know why I keep doing this. Even though you do know. You just cannot yet override the momentum behind it. And momentum is not broken by insight. It is broken by interruption at the exact moment it begins. But interruption requires energy. And energy is lowest at the exact moment most urges appear. This is not coincidence. It is timing. The system does not attack you when you are strong. It waits until you are least likely to resist. Tired, unfocused, emotionally compressed, mentally scattered. That is not weakness. That is predictability. And predictability is what makes the pattern repeatable. So the real struggle is not against desire itself. It is against timing. Now pay attention to something most people overlook completely. Every time you complete the cycle, even if it brings regret afterward, your nervous system records it as closure. Not success. Closure. And closure is powerful, because the brain prefers completed loops over unresolved tension. So even negative outcomes can become reinforcing if they resolve internal pressure. This is why people repeat patterns they intellectually disagree with. Because the system prioritizes relief over alignment. And unless you introduce a different form of closure, the old cycle will always feel more complete. This is where discipline must evolve beyond resistance. It must become replacement, not just stopping behavior, but replacing closure mechanisms. Because if you only remove the behavior without replacing the relief structure, the system will rebuild it automatically. This is not theory, it is repetition logic, and it is why most attempts at change fail silently. Now consider your environment for a moment. Not physically, behaviorally. What cues exist around you that repeatedly trigger the same sequence? Time of day, emotional states, devices, locations, even certain thoughts that always precede the same action. These are not neutral. They are triggers that have been trained into significance. Your environment is not just where you live. It is what trains your responses. And over time, your mind stops distinguishing between trigger and instruction. It reacts automatically. Which means if nothing in your environment changes, your behavior will continue to return to baseline. No matter how strong your intention is in isolated moments. This is where most people underestimate their situation. They try to win internal battles inside unchanged systems. And then wonder why nothing stabilizes. But there is a point where awareness begins to shift behavior slightly. It starts small. A delay, a pause, a moment where the automatic sequence does not activate immediately. That pause feels insignificant, but it is the first crack in automation. Because inside that pause, something new becomes possible. Choice that is not yet overridden by repetition. And that is where everything starts to change. Not in stopping, but in delaying. Because delay introduces observation, and observation interrupts identity fusion with impulse. Now here is something you need to understand clearly. You are not trying to eliminate desire. That is impossible. You are trying to change your relationship with it. From command to signal, from instruction to noise. And that transformation only happens through repeated interruption of automatic execution. At first, it feels unstable. You will still lose some moments. That is expected. But even loss begins to shift meaning when it is no longer unconscious. Because once you become aware during the cycle, even briefly, something changes in how it is stored. It is no longer blind repetition. It becomes recognized pattern, and recognized patterns lose some of their authority over time. This is where many people give up too early, because they expect immediate transformation. But identity does not flip. It accumulates evidence. Each interruption is evidence. Each delay is evidence. Each conscious refusal is evidence that a different version of you exists, even if it is still weak. Now there is a deeper layer forming underneath this. Something most people avoid noticing. The version of you that keeps giving in is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to reduce discomfort. But it is doing so using outdated strategies. Strategies that were reinforced because they worked temporarily, not because they were optimal. So when you fight that version aggressively, you often strengthen internal conflict instead of reducing it. Because conflict itself becomes stimulation. And stimulation feeds the cycle. What actually begins to dissolve it is not aggression. It is replacement through consistency. A different pattern that slowly becomes more familiar than the old one. And familiarity determines behavior more than motivation ever will. At this stage, you might start noticing something subtle. The urge does not disappear. But its urgency fluctuates. Sometimes it feels strong. Sometimes it feels hollow. Sometimes it arrives without emotional weight. That inconsistency is not random. It is a sign that reinforcement is weakening. Because patterns lose intensity when not consistently rewarded. But they do not vanish immediately. They linger, testing, waiting for the old response. And if the old response still appears often enough, the pattern remains alive. So this becomes a question of accumulation again. Not perfection, but direction. Now, somewhere in this process, something begins to shift in identity perception. You stop seeing yourself as someone who tries to stop, and start seeing yourself as someone who sometimes interrupts. That is a small change in language internally. But it reflects a deeper structural shift. Because identity is not defined by what you intend. It is defined by what you repeatedly do under pressure. And pressure is the only environment that matters for this transformation. That is why casual effort never holds. Only pressured repetition does. And pressure will continue to return. Not to punish you, but to test consistency of new pathways. Now there is a point where this becomes more than behavior correction. It becomes identity negotiation. And that negotiation is still ongoing. But something is starting to form underneath it. A quieter version of you that does not react as quickly. Not fully stable yet, but present enough to notice the difference between impulse and decision. And that difference will matter more than you realize later. Because it is not about stopping everything at once. It is about who you are becoming in the moments between impulse and action. And that space is still expanding. But not yet dominant, which means the real shift has not fully arrived. It is still forming beneath repetition. And what you do next will determine which side strengthens further. Not in theory. In practice, there is a point in this process where something changes that you will not immediately celebrate. In fact, you might not notice it at first. Because it does not feel like victory. It feels like awareness without release. You start catching the pattern earlier. Sometimes even before it fully forms. You recognize the emotional setup. The triggers. The internal negotiation. The familiar script unfolding in real time. And yet, the outcome still sometimes repeats. This is where most people misjudge their progress. They assume nothing is changing because behavior is not fully stable yet. But they are looking at the wrong layer. The real shift begins earlier than behavior. It begins in interruption of unconsciousness. And unconscious repetition is what used to define you. Not the action itself. The lack of awareness during it. Now that awareness is entering the system, even partially, something irreversible has started. Because once a pattern is seen clearly while it is happening, it cannot remain fully automatic anymore. It becomes partially observed, and observation changes the structure of experience itself. But this stage is uncomfortable in a specific way. Because you are no longer fully blind to the pattern, but not yet fully free from it. You are in between identities. And in between states create internal tension that feels like instability. You begin to judge yourself more harshly, not because you are worse, but because you are more aware of what is happening. And awareness without control feels like exposure. So the mind tries to resolve that discomfort quickly, often by returning to the familiar behavior just to restore psychological balance. This is why relapse often follows insight. Not because insight failed, but because insight created imbalance before new structure was formed. Now consider something important here. The version of you that keeps repeating the cycle is not ignorant anymore. It is reinforced. It has history. It has efficiency. It has ease of access. And it will always feel like the shortest route out of discomfort. That does not disappear just because you understand the pattern. Understanding only removes blindness. It does not remove attraction. So you begin to experience a split that feels increasingly real. One part of you sees clearly what is happening. Another part still follows the most familiar path under pressure. And the tension between those two creates internal friction that can either destroy consistency or build discipline depending on what you do with it. Most people collapse under that friction, because they try to eliminate it instead of using it. But friction is not the enemy here. Friction is transition. It is the space where identity is no longer fixed, but not yet replaced. And that space is uncomfortable because it demands patience without reassurance. There is no immediate feedback that tells you are winning. Only subtle shifts that accumulate silently. Now there is something deeper happening beneath this that is often missed entirely. Each time you interrupt the automatic cycle, even if you eventually give in later, you are creating a competing memory trace. A second pathway forming alongside the original one. And the brain begins to hold both possibilities. One reinforced by repetition. One reinforced by interruption. At first, the stronger one dominates. But dominance is not permanence. It is frequency. And frequency can change, slowly, through repetition of a different kind. This is where most people underestimate themselves. They assume the stronger pattern defines them permanently. But neural efficiency is not identity. It is current preference based on history. And history is still being written. Now something important happens when you begin interrupting more often. The urge itself starts to lose clarity. It becomes less structured, less convincing, less absolute. Not because it disappears, but because it is no longer followed immediately every time it appears. So it begins to lose authority over time. And authority is not removed through argument. It is removed through disobedience. Repeated disobedience. Until the signal no longer guarantees action. And when that happens enough times, something shifts in perception. You start to experience urges as separate from self. Not commands. Not identity. Just signals passing through awareness. And that separation is critical. Because addiction depends on fusion. The belief that urge equals identity. Once that fusion breaks, even partially, the entire structure begins to weaken. But again, this is not dramatic. It is subtle. You might still repeat the behavior sometimes. But even those repetitions feel different internally. Less automatic, more witnessed. And that witnessing creates distance. Now there is a stage here that often confuses people. Because improvement does not feel linear. Some days you feel in control. Other days you feel completely back at the beginning. This inconsistency leads to doubt. But what is actually happening is not regression. It is instability in new pattern formation. Old pathways are still active. New pathways are still fragile. So the system oscillates between them depending on conditions like stress, fatigue, and emotional load. This is why discipline cannot depend on ideal conditions. It must survive non-ideal ones. Otherwise, it remains theoretical. Now consider your attention in those moments. When the urge appears, where does your attention go? Does it collapse inward into desire? Or does it expand slightly into observation? That small difference determines everything. Because collapse leads to automatic execution. Observation creates space. And space is where interruption lives. But observation is not natural at first. It has to be practiced. Because your default training has been reaction, not witnessing. So you are essentially retraining attention itself. Not just behavior. Attention. And attention is the foundation of identity formation. Now something else begins to happen as this process continues. You start noticing consequences earlier. Not after the action. Before it. You begin to feel the trajectory of repetition before it completes. And that feeling is not moral judgment. It is pattern recognition becoming faster than execution. At this stage, something subtle begins to emerge. A moment where you pause without forcing yourself to pause. Not resistance. Recognition. And that distinction matters. Because forced resistance still keeps the urge central. Recognition reduces its importance. And what loses importance loses power. There is also a shift happening socially, even if no one else sees it. Your behavior begins to become less predictable externally. Not because you are acting differently in obvious ways, but because internal delays begin to alter outcomes. Small pauses change sequences, and sequences determine identity over time. Now there is a moment in this phase where frustration peaks. Because you can see both versions of yourself clearly now. The one you are becoming, and the one you keep slipping into. And that awareness creates pressure. But that pressure is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of proximity. You are close enough to see contrast. And contrast always increases tension before resolution. But resolution is not immediate. It is earned through repetition under tension. Not escape from it. So the real question quietly forming underneath everything now is no longer about stopping behavior. It is about which version of you becomes easier to access under pressure. Because the system will always default to what is easiest in the moment of impulse. And ease is shaped by repetition. So nothing here is theoretical anymore. It is mechanical. Every interruption is a vote. Every repetition is a reinforcement. Every delay is a restructuring of identity pathways. And over time, those votes accumulate into something irreversible. But you are still in the middle phase, where neither identity fully dominates. And the outcome is still being decided in small silent moments that no one else observes. And that is where the real weight of this process exists. Not in grand decisions, but in unspoken ones, that continue shaping who you become without announcement. And something in you already knows this is not finished yet. Not even close. At this point, something begins to become uncomfortable in a different way. Not because the struggle is new, but because it is no longer invisible. You cannot fully ignore it anymore. Even when you try to move through your day normally, there is a background awareness running quietly underneath everything. You see the pattern forming before it completes. You feel the familiar sequence preparing itself. And you recognize the exact direction it will take if nothing interrupts it. This is where awareness stops being passive and starts becoming pressure. Because once you can predict your own behavior in real time, ignorance is no longer available as an escape. And without ignorance, every decision carries weight. Even small ones. Especially small ones. Now here is something that quietly changes everything, though it rarely feels important when it first appears. The gap between urge and action starts to stretch. Not dramatically. Not permanently at first. Just enough to notice. A fraction of time where the impulse is present, but not yet executed. And inside that fraction, something unfamiliar begins to emerge. You are no longer fully inside the pattern. But you are not yet outside it either. You are observing it while still being pulled by it. And that dual position creates tension that most people misinterpret as instability. But it is actually the beginning of control. Because control does not begin with elimination. It begins with delay. Now the mind will try to minimize the importance of that delay. It will say it is meaningless. Too small to matter. Not a real change. But that is how transformation always starts. In increments too small to feel significant. Until they accumulate into something irreversible. And the reason it feels subtle is because identity does not update in dramatic leaps. It updates through repetition of micro-decisions under pressure. Now there is another layer forming underneath this process. You begin to notice that the urge itself is not stable. It fluctuates based on context. It strengthens in certain emotional states, weakens in others. Sometimes it appears intense, almost convincing. Other times it feels hollow, almost artificial. And this inconsistency reveals something important. The urge is not a constant truth. It is a conditioned response tied to internal and external states, which means it can be influenced indirectly, not by force, but by structure, by changing what precedes it. Your fatigue level, your emotional triggers, your environmental cues, your attention patterns, all of these shape how strongly the cycle activates. So what you are dealing with is not a single enemy. It is a system of triggers interacting with a learned response. And systems can be redesigned, but not instantly. Now something begins to happen when redesign starts taking effect. You begin to experience small moments of neutrality, where the urge appears but does not immediately escalate. It does not fully take over your attention. It does not dominate your decision space. It simply exists, and then passes, without completion. And this is a critical shift. Because previously, the urge demanded resolution. Now it can exist without resolution. And when a system loses the requirement for immediate closure, its power begins to dissolve. But this stage is fragile, because the old pattern still exists underneath. And it will attempt to reassert itself whenever conditions weaken your resistance. So the process is not removal. It is displacement. One pattern slowly losing priority as another becomes more familiar. Now there is a deeper psychological conflict emerging here. You start to experience identity lag, where your internal self-image is no longer aligned with your actual behavior patterns. You begin to think of yourself as someone who is changing, but your actions still occasionally contradict that belief. And that contradiction creates discomfort, because humans naturally seek alignment between identity and behavior. When they do not match, tension forms. And most people resolve that tension by reverting to familiar behavior. But in this case, the tension is not a problem. It is a transition state, a sign that identity is being rewritten in real time. Now here is something that becomes increasingly important as this continues. Your decisions under pressure are no longer just about the present moment. They are becoming training signals for your future reactions. Every time you interrupt the cycle, even briefly, you are lowering the automatic strength of the old pathway. Every time you follow it, you reinforce its efficiency. And efficiency is what determines default behavior. Not intention, not awareness alone, but repetition under emotional load. This is why discipline is not built in calm conditions. It is built in the exact moments where the system expects you to fail. Now something subtle begins to happen in your perception of yourself. You stop seeing relapse as a complete reset, and start seeing it as a partial return. Because even when the old behavior happens, it no longer carries the same unconscious identity attachment it once did. There is awareness present now, even if brief, and that awareness changes the internal structure of the experience. It creates distance between action and identity, and that distance is essential. Because addiction thrives in full identification. I am this behavior. Once that link weakens, the behavior loses authority over time. Now there is another phase emerging here that is often misunderstood. You begin to feel moments of confidence. Short periods where control feels natural, where the urge feels manageable, where resistance feels stable, and then, unpredictably, you fall back into old patterns again. This inconsistency can feel discouraging. But it is not regression. It is recalibration. Because new systems do not stabilize evenly. They fluctuate while strengthening, and stability only appears after enough repetition under varied conditions. Now consider something carefully here. The strongest reinforcement in your system is not pleasure. It is relief from tension. And every time you give in, you are not just seeking pleasure. You are ending internal pressure quickly. That is why the cycle is so persistent. It is efficient at resolving discomfort. So if you want to break it, you cannot only remove the behavior. You must learn to tolerate unresolved tension without immediately collapsing it. And that is where most people struggle. Because tolerance feels like absence of reward. But in reality, it is the foundation of control. Now something begins to shift in your internal dialogue. You stop negotiating with yourself in the same way. The arguments become shorter, less elaborate, less convincing. Because awareness begins to override justification faster than before. And when justification weakens, action becomes less automatic. But this is still not complete transformation. It is transition. And transitions always contain instability. Because two identities are still active. One built on repetition, one built on interruption, and neither has fully dominated yet. Which means every moment of pressure is still a negotiation between them. Not evenly. but progressively shifting. Now there is a point where something becomes unavoidable. You start noticing that your environment is not neutral. It is actively shaping your decisions. Certain times of day carry predictable vulnerability. Certain emotional states lower resistance. Certain patterns of behavior always precede the cycle. And once you see that clearly, responsibility becomes more precise. Because you can no longer pretend the behavior is random. It is structured, predictable, and therefore modifiable, but only if you intervene earlier in the sequence. Not at the point of action, but at the point of setup. Now there is something forming underneath all of this that has not fully revealed itself yet. A version of you that is no longer reacting first, but observing first, and that version is still fragile, still inconsistent, still developing strength through repetition. But it is present now, and it is becoming more accessible under pressure than before, which means something important is happening. The weaker version is no longer the only default. It is now competing, and competition always signals transition. But the outcome of that competition is still being decided in moments that feel small, invisible, almost irrelevant. Yet those are the exact moments where identity is being rewritten. And you are still inside that process. Not after it, not before it, inside it, and it is not finished yet. At this stage, something becomes clear that most people avoid confronting for as long as possible. You are not trying to remove a habit. You are replacing a version of yourself that was built through repetition. And anything built through repetition does not disappear just because you understand it. It weakens only when it is no longer consistently reinforced. So the real battlefield was never willpower. It was repetition under pressure. That is what built the old identity. And that is what must dismantle it. Not insight alone, not motivation, not emotional intensity, but the steady interruption of automatic behavior in the exact moments where it feels most justified. Now pay attention to what has actually changed so far. The urge still appears, but it no longer fully owns the outcome every time. The sequence still begins, but it does not always complete itself automatically. There is delay now. There is awareness now. There is hesitation where there used to be certainty. And that hesitation is not weakness. It is structural disruption, because anything that requires less certainty to execute begins to lose dominance over time. But the system you are dealing with does not surrender quickly. It tests consistency. It returns under stress. It appears in fatigue. It resurfaces in emotional instability. Not to punish you, but to measure whether the new pattern is real or temporary. Now here is what most people miss entirely. You are not measured by your best moments. You are measured by your most vulnerable ones. Because that is where identity is actually revealed. Not in control, but in collapse points. And every time you interrupt the cycle in those moments, you are not just resisting behavior. You are rewriting the conditions under which your identity defaults. Slowly, quietly, but permanently, if repeated enough. Now there is something that begins to shift at a deeper level. The idea of giving in starts to lose its automatic appeal. Not because desire disappears, but because the cost becomes more visible in real time. You begin to see what each repetition actually reinforces. Not just relief, but identity regression. Not dramatic, but incremental. And accumulation matters more than intensity. Because identity is not shaped by isolated extremes. It is shaped by patterns that repeat unnoticed. Now there is a final phase emerging from all of this. It is not a moment of perfection. It is a moment of recognition without confusion. Where the urge still exists, but it no longer defines direction. Where discomfort still appears, but it no longer dictates action immediately. Where the weaker version of you still shows up, but no longer feels like the only available option. And that is the real shift. Not elimination. Multiplicity of choice. Because once you have more than one accessible response under pressure, identity is no longer fixed. It becomes navigable, and what is navigable can be directed. Now something important to understand before this ends. You will still face moments where the old pattern feels stronger. Where it feels automatic again. Where awareness feels temporarily absent. That is not failure. That is depth of conditioning still being unwound. Because systems built over time do not collapse in a straight line. They fade in layers, and each layer requires repetition to weaken. Now here is where everything converges. Every time you give in, you train familiarity with weakness. Every time you interrupt, You train familiarity with control. And whichever becomes more familiar will eventually become your default. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because identity always follows repetition. So the question is no longer whether you understand this. The question is which pattern you are rehearsing when it actually matters. Not in theory, not in reflection, but in the exact moment where impulse and awareness collide. Because that moment is where the weaker version of you is either reinforced again or quietly replaced. And nothing about that moment is random anymore. It is trained, it is predictable, and it is still being written by what you choose under pressure. Now there is only one thing left that needs to be understood. You are not waiting for change. You are actively participating in its formation. Every single time the cycle appears. And the direction of that formation is still not fully locked. Not yet, but it is moving closer to stability with every repetition that interrupts the old pattern instead of completing it. And what happens next depends entirely on which version of you becomes easier to access when no one is watching, no reward is immediate, and no one is there to confirm the decision. That is the only moment that has ever mattered. And it is still happening. Right now, silently, before the next urge ever appears. So observe what you become in those moments. Because that is what you are becoming permanently. Not what you intend, what you repeat, and the repetition is still ongoing. Slow, quiet, determining everything. Now carry this forward, not as information, but as structure. Because what you allow repeatedly does not remain a choice for long. It becomes identity. And identity, once formed through repetition, does not ask for permission anymore. It simply continues, unless interrupted, again and again, until the weaker version no longer recognizes itself as the default. That is the point where change is no longer theoretical. It is irreversible.